The wolf was watching her. Sarah knew it the way she knew most things in Ashenvale Keep, not because anyone told her, not because she had been permitted close enough to confirm it, but because the air in the lower corridor had changed. She had been carrying the feed pail from the cold pantry to the north wing, the same walk she made every morning before the keep stirred, and she had stopped. Just stopped, her boots gone still on the stone, the pail handle cutting into her palm, and the knowing had arrived not as a thought, but as a pressure against the back of her neck, steady and specific, the way a gaze lands when it is held too long and too deliberately to be anything else. She did not turn around. That was the first morning. She told no one, because there was no one in particular to tell, and because she was not certain she had not imagined it. The north wing was cold enough in early winter to produce strange sensations, and she had slept badly, and the wolf, if it had been the wolf, lived behind a reinforced iron door at the far end of the keep's oldest corridor, a door she had never been closer to than 10 paces, a door she had been told, during her brief orientation 5 years ago, to regard as a permanent closed chapter. So she set the pail down, rolled the feeling back from her shoulders like a cape that did not fit, and continued on. The wolf had not eaten in a long time. Everyone in Ashenvale knew this. It was not a secret exactly, more like a piece of institutional weather, something that had been true for so long that acknowledging it had become imprecise, the way you would say the North Tower is cold, rather than the North Tower has been without heat since a specific date someone might have recorded. The staff spoke of it rarely, and when they did, it was in the tone people use for facts that carry grief inside them, carefully, briefly, without looking at the thing directly. 217 years, as best as anyone had counted. The Alpha King, Kalen Voss, had not shifted in 217 years. His wolf had not fed, had not run, had not, by any visible evidence, done anything except what a buried thing does, which is endure its own burial. He was 403 years old, and he looked, to any eye that caught him in the right light, like a man in his late 30s who carried his age somewhere internal and invisible, a weight distributed evenly beneath the surface so that it did not deform him so much as anchor him, pressing him into the ground with a density that younger wolves simply did not have. Sarah had seen him, at distance, 3 times in 5 years, once crossing the outer courtyard, his shoulders blocking the low winter sun, once standing at a second-floor window while she swept the steps below, his gaze on the middle distance, turned entirely away from everything she occupied. Once at the head of the quarterly staff assembly, where he stood without sitting, without speaking, and regarded the gathered household with an expression that was not cold, but removed, a presence that had decoupled from the ordinary machinery of wanting to be liked. She had made no impression on him. She was quite certain of this. In the reasonable, unsentimental way she was certain of most things about her position here. She was a maid. She cleaned the lower corridors, managed the cold pantry stores, and fed the animals in the lower pens twice a day. These were tasks that had belonged to no one in particular for some years, and so had fallen to her. She was an omega. She had gray eyes and ink-stained wrists from cataloging the pantry inventory in the ledger she kept on her own time, because no one else did, and the disorganization had cost the kitchen 3 spoiled deliveries the winter before she arrived. Her uniform was a size too large, inherited from a woman named Bess, who had left for the Valley Village the spring Sarah came, and she had never requested a replacement because the request would have required speaking to the head housekeeper Aldrin, who regarded omegas with a practiced, bureaucratic patience that was not cruelty, but preference, the preference for a category of person who did not require her to think carefully. Sarah was 24. She had been at Ashenvale Keep for 5 years. She had made no enemies worth naming and no friends worth losing, and she had achieved, she thought, a kind of settlement with her own invisibility, Not peace, but a workable arrangement, the way a stone in a riverbed achieves an arrangement with the water moving over it. She did not perform contentment, she simply did not require rescue. The second morning, the wolf watched her again. She knew it before she reached the corridor, because the air arriving from the north wing smelled different, faintly different. Not wrong, but altered, the way a room smells when it has recently been occupied by something that has exhaled into it, and then gone still, waiting. The pail was heavier that morning, loaded with bone scraps from the kitchen that Cook had set aside. Cook left these outside the cold pantry door twice a week, always wrapped in cloth, always without comment. It had been happening for 3 years. Sarah had never asked why, and Cook had never explained, and so it had become a kind of ambient arrangement between them, a small kindness, operating below the level of language. She set the scraps in the metal tray that extended on a bracket through the iron door's small pass-through. The one she had been told, during orientation, was for the keep's working hounds. She had always suspected this was not entirely accurate. The tray was too large for hounds, and hounds did not make the corridor hold its breath the way the north wing held its breath. She withdrew her hands. She walked back the way she had come. The feeling on the back of her neck followed her the entire way to the stairs, and then released, precisely, as though something had decided to let her go. She thought about that release for the rest of the morning, the deliberateness of it. Something had been deciding things about her, and she had only just begun to understand it was doing so. By the fourth morning, she knew the routine of it well enough to feel the difference when it changed. She arrived at the north corridor with the tray loaded, bones that day, and a length of dried meat, the origin of which she did not examine too closely, and the air did not smell of waiting. It smelled of something else, something she did not have an immediate name for, cedar and iron, and something underneath those, low and warm, like embers that had not gone entirely cold. She stopped, stood very still, set the tray through the pass-through and waited, which was not something she had done before. The scraps were gone in under a minute. She heard nothing, no movement, no sound, and yet the tray came back empty, slid back smoothly from the other side, in a motion too deliberate and too careful to belong to an animal operating on hunger alone. Sarah stood at the pass-through for a long moment, her breath making small clouds in the cold. She thought, it is choosing how to take the food. And then, with the particular precision of someone who has learned to name exactly what she observes without embellishment, something on the other side of that door is conscious and patient, and it has been watching how I move. She returned the following morning with more. By the second week, she had developed a routine, though routine was perhaps too casual a word for what it was becoming. She arrived at the north corridor 20 minutes earlier than her other morning tasks required. She loaded the pass-through tray not only with the scraps Cook left, but with whatever she could bring that had texture and weight to it. Dried meat, raw cuts she requested from the kitchen stock ledger, under the line item for hound feed, which no one had questioned in 5 years, and which no one questioned now. She did not hurry. She set each piece in the tray with care, and she spoke, quietly, into the air on her side of the door, because something about the particular quality of the silence on the other side seemed to her like listening, and not like emptiness. She did not speak of herself. She spoke of the morning, the weather, the condition of the frozen yard she had crossed, small facts, stated plainly, because they were what she had. On the 9th day, she placed her hand flat on the iron door, just for a moment, before she left. She felt the warmth through the metal, not cold, as she had expected iron in winter to be. Warm, and faintly vibrating, with a low resonance she felt in her wrist and her forearm and the inside of her elbow, as though something stood close on the other side and breathed against the door. She removed her hand. She walked back to her morning work. Her pulse, she noticed, was not entirely steady. The head groundskeeper, Maddock, mentioned it on the 11th day. He said it to Cook, not to Sarah, in the kitchen corridor while Sarah was returning the feed pail, and he said it in the tone men use when they are speaking near a person they have decided is not quite present. The north wing smells different. Not bad, just different. Cook glanced at Sarah. Sarah looked at the inventory ledger she was carrying and continued past. She heard Maddox say, behind her, "Has someone been feeding it?" Cook said nothing, but Sarah felt Cook's eyes on her back the full length of the corridor. It was on the 14th morning that she understood the situation had changed. She arrived at the north wing to find the corridor was not empty. It was simply there, in a way corridors are not, a charged stillness that had nothing to do with architecture. She loaded the tray. She spoke, as she had come to do, in her quiet, factual way. "Frost overnight," she said, "the kind that makes the stones under the east arch slippery. Someone should put sand down before the afternoon traffic." And she placed her hand on the door, as she had done for several mornings now. The warmth was there, and then the sound. Low, below sound really. More vibration than pitch, the kind of frequency she felt in her sternum, rather than heard with her ears. And it lasted 3 seconds, and then the corridor was quiet again. She did not move for a long moment. She had heard wolves before. Working wolves, pack wolves, the occasional courier animal brought through the gates. She had heard the full register of lupine sound, from alarm to comfort, to the territorial resonance that made lesser wolves step back involuntarily. She had never heard anything like this. This was not alarm, and it was not comfort in the way those things were usually meant. It was something she could only describe, later and to herself, as an answer, as though she had been, without knowing it, asking a question for 14 days, and whatever lived behind that door had finally decided she had earned its response. She left in the same measured way she always did, and spent the rest of the day carrying something in her chest that she could not precisely identify, not fear, not excitement, but something that had the weight of both and the temperature of neither. What she did not know, and had no way of knowing, was that 4 floors above her, in the study that faced the inner courtyard and collected the grey morning light through tall windows, Kalen Voss had set down the report he had been reading and had not picked it up again. He had not been reading it, in the final account. He had been sitting with it while his attention was entirely elsewhere. Specifically, it was in the north corridor, where it should not have been, where he had been trying, with considerable effort and approximately 0 success, not to let it go. His steward Tomas had entered 3 times in the past 2 hours. Each time, Kalen had been sitting exactly as he was, report in hand, and each time Tomas had left the papers he'd brought, said nothing, and retreated in a way that suggested he was making note of something, without yet being certain what. The morning light moved across the desk. Kalen set the report down. She had spoken to it, was the thing. Not in ceremony, not in the formal address and petition style some of his more ambitious council members had tried over the decades, which had been received with a silence so complete it had become policy, an unwritten one, that no one attempted address through the north wing door. She had spoken to it the way a person speaks to something they have decided deserves the courtesy of being spoken to. She had talked about the frost, his wolf, which had not surfaced in 217 years, which had held itself in a subterranean endurance that he had stopped fully mapping decades ago because the mapping was its own kind of grief, had made a sound 3 minutes ago. He had felt it move through the connection between them like a word said in a room he had been pretending was empty. He sat with that for a long time. Then he called for Tomas and said, very quietly, "Tell me about the Omega who works the north corridor." There was a pause that had information in it, though Tomas kept his face correct. Then Tomas said, "Her name is Sarah. She has worked the lower corridor and pantry rotation for 5 years. She holds the pantry inventory ledger on her own initiative. She has not missed a morning shift in 4 years. And the feeding? Kaelin asked. Tomas's pause this time was fractionally shorter. She began using the North Wing pass-through approximately 2 weeks ago, under the hound feed allocation. Kaelin looked at the window, at the grey courtyard below, empty now. He thought about what the wolf had sounded like when it moved. Not frenzy, not desperation, something measured, considered. An answer, he thought, and was unsettled by how precisely that word fit. 2 weeks, he said. Yes, Tomas said. She has been doing this for 2 weeks, and no one thought to mention it. Tomas did not respond to this directly, which was itself a response. What Kaelin understood from the silence was, she is an Omega maid, and the assumption had been, among everyone who noticed, that it would come to nothing. That it had come to nothing was so expected as to not require reporting. Kaelin dismissed Tomas. He stood at the window a long time. Outside, a groundskeeper crossed the courtyard, then a kitchen boy, then, at the far edge of the yard, a small figure in an oversized uniform coat, her path direct and unhurried, carrying something, the empty feed pail, he realized, on its way back to the pantry. He watched her walk the full length of the courtyard. She did not look up. He had not expected that to matter to him, and it did, a small needle of a thing that had no reasonable explanation he was willing to produce just yet. He left the window and returned to his desk. He did not pick up the report. He thought, instead, about 2 weeks of mornings he had not witnessed, and a wolf that had, for the first time in over 2 centuries, decided something was worth moving toward. He would need to think about how to proceed. He would need, in particular, to be careful. On the 16th morning, he came to the north corridor. Sarah heard him before she saw him. She was at the pass-through, her hand on the iron door. Mid-sentence, she had been telling the door about a strange bird she had spotted on the east battlement at first light, grey and still as a gargoyle, possibly a crane, though she had not been close enough to be certain, and the sound of footsteps reached her, with a particular quality of weight that she recognized without having consciously catalogued it. She had heard this quality of footstep from a distance, crossing the outer courtyard 3 times in 5 years. She did not startle. She turned, her back to the iron door, and waited. He stopped perhaps 6 feet from her. He was in a plain grey undershirt and dark trousers, no formal overcoat, which meant he had come directly from wherever he slept or worked, rather than preparing for a corridor encounter, and which she noted only to note it, without attaching significance she could not support. He was very large, not in the way of men who have worked hard for it, but in the way of something that simply came out that way, dense and solidly planted, as though he had a different relationship with gravity than other people. His eyes were dark, a brown so deep it read as black in the corridor's low light, and he was looking at her with an expression she needed a moment to read. Not coldness, not authority, or not primarily. It was something more concentrated than that. He was looking at her, the way someone looks when they have been watching from a distance for several days and have now come closer and are in the process of measuring whether what they see confirms what they suspected. She returned the look with equanimity. She had steady eyes. It was one of the few things she had that no one could issue to someone else or take back. Well, she thought, and said nothing. The door was warm against her spine. Behind her, through the iron, the low hum was already starting. He heard it. She saw the moment he heard it, in the way his jaw changed, a barely visible shift, a tightening that was not anger. His gaze moved from her face to the door and back. "Did it eat?" he asked. His voice was lower than she had expected, not quieter but deeper, with a texture to it that suggested infrequent use. "Yes," she said, "every morning." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you bring it?" She told him. She told him exactly, itemized and factual, the cuts and quantities and the schedule she had worked out across 2 weeks of incremental adjustment. He listened without interrupting, and she noticed that he listened the way people listen when they are taking account of something, rather than waiting for their own turn to speak. When she finished, he said, "It hasn't come to the door for anyone in over 100 years." She absorbed this. Then she said, "It came on the second morning." Something moved across his face that she did not name aloud, though she filed it carefully. It was not surprise. It was something that had the shape of recognition and the weight of something far older than surprise. He looked at the door for a long moment, and Sarah felt the resonance through the iron increase slightly at her back, a warmth pressing into her shoulder blades, and she thought, "It knows he is here." He stepped forward. He placed his palm flat against the iron door, as she had done, and stood there. The sound from behind the door changed, not louder, different in quality, something that moved from question to recognition, a shift in register, the way a voice changes when it stops asking and starts answering. He removed his hand. He turned back to her with the deliberateness of a man choosing not to be undone in front of another person. "What is your name?" he asked, though she was reasonably certain he already knew. "Sarah," she said. He said her name back to her, not in repetition exactly, not testing it, more in the way someone places an object down carefully on a surface and notes that it fits. Then he said, "I would like to observe tomorrow." Not attend, she noticed. Observe. "That is your corridor to be in," she said. He nearly smiled. It was contained, whatever it was, but it was there for a moment, and she filed that too. She looked at him directly and said, "I'll be here at first light." He nodded once and left. And the hum behind her persisted until his footsteps were entirely gone, and then, for the first time in her experience of the North Corridor, the iron door's temperature dropped a degree, the warmth retreating inward, as though what was inside had been, for just a moment, reaching toward both of them at once, and now had settled back to wait. She stood in the corridor a moment longer. Her pulse was not entirely steady, for the second time in 16 mornings. She said, quietly, to the door, "I know." She thought, though she could not have said why, that it did. He came the next morning as he had said he would, and the morning after that, and the 3 mornings after that. He came in his plain undershirt and dark trousers, without announcement, and he stood at a distance from the door and the pass-through that was specific and deliberate, close enough to observe, far enough to not interfere, and he watched her work. He did not speak much. She did not require him to. She went about the routine she had built, speaking to the door in her quiet, factual morning voice, and she was aware of him against the wall, arms folded, silent, with the particular quality of attention he had that made the air denser without making it tighter. On the 3rd morning of this arrangement he said, "You talk to it about ordinary things." She looked at him over her shoulder. "I have ordinary things to say." He considered this. Then he said, "What does it like best?" "It's not about what it likes," she said, turning back to the pass-through. She loaded the tray with steady hands. "It's about it understanding that whoever is here will come back, that the morning is reliable, that there's no performance." Silence from behind her. Long enough that she began to wonder if she had overstepped some unmarked line. Then, "You think it stopped eating because there was no one consistent." "I think," she said carefully, "it stopped eating because it didn't trust anything, and it can't be argued back into trust. It can only be shown." She pushed the tray through. The contents disappeared with the same careful efficiency she had come to recognize across 3 weeks. Behind her, she felt Kalen go very still. "I have been trying," he said, very quietly, "to argue it back." She did not turn around. She gave him the same courtesy she gave the wolf, which was to not make the moment into more than it could hold. She said, "I know." A pause. Then, lower, How long do you think it takes? She considered the honest answer. She gave it, because she had no other kind. As long as it takes to believe you're not going to leave. The tray came back empty. She withdrew it, set it aside, and placed her palm against the door. The warmth was immediate, steady, like pressing against something sleeping that is nonetheless aware of you. She stayed like that for a moment, and then she stepped back and turned. Kaelin was looking at her with that concentrated expression she had catalogued once before, and it was doing the same thing it had done the first morning, measuring, confirming, but there was something else in it now that had not been there on the first morning, something that had moved past assessment into territory she chose not to yet name. She met his eyes. "Stay," she nearly expected him to say, but he didn't say anything. She picked up the empty pail. She said, without theatrics, "Same time tomorrow." He said, "Yes." She walked back down the corridor. She did not look back. She was fairly certain she heard, from behind the iron door, a sound so low it was nearly nothing, almost contented, the kind of sound a thing makes when it has gotten two things it wanted in the same morning. Aldrin came to find Sarah on a Thursday, which she knew because Thursday was ledger day, and she had the pantry inventory spread across the work table when the head housekeeper appeared in the doorway. Aldrin was a tall woman, gray-haired and precise, who wore her institutional authority as naturally as her uniform. She had the look of someone who had prepared the shape of a conversation before beginning it. She sat down, something she rarely did in the pantry, and she said, "There are concerns." Sarah did not stop writing. "About what?" "About the time you're spending in the North Corridor." Aldrin paused, in the way of someone weighing whether to use the formal language or the practical language. "The council has noted it." Sarah looked up. "The council?" "They have asked Steward Tomas to open a formal review." Aldrin's voice was steady, and Sarah heard in it, accurately she thought, rather than charitably, the note of a woman who was delivering a message she had not initiated, but had agreed to carry. "The concern is that an unclaimed Omega is spending unsupervised time in proximity to the Alpha King, and that this represents a breach of Protocol 14. Sarah knew Protocol 14. It was the regulation requiring that interactions between an unmated Omega and the Alpha King in private settings be formally witnessed or formally approved, a rule which had existed for centuries, and which, in ordinary circumstances, was both reasonable and unobjectionable. In the current circumstances, it was a lever. She set her pen down. Who specifically on the council? Aldrin did not answer this directly. She said, "There are several signatures." Sarah looked at the inventory ledger. She thought of the North Corridor, and the warmth of the door, and the sound behind it. She thought of Kaelin standing against the wall with his arms folded, listening with the quality of attention that was meant to understand rather than adjudicate. She thought, "I have been preparing for this without knowing I was preparing for it." She said, "There is a record." Aldrin looked at her. "Every morning I have entered the North Corridor," she said. "I have noted it in the hound feed allocation log, including time of entry and exit, quantities used, and purpose. The steward's office has had access to this log since I began keeping it 5 years ago." She paused. "Also, the Alpha King has been present in the corridor personally for the last 9 of those mornings. I am not certain how unsupervised it is possible to be in the presence of the Alpha King." Aldrin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The review is still formally opened." Sarah said, "Then I will prepare a formal response." Aldrin stood. There was something in her posture that had shifted fractionally, something that was not approval, but a recalibration, the look of a woman reconsidering the category she had placed someone in. She said, "The review convenes in 3 days." Sarah said, "I'll be ready in 1. She was. She brought 4 things to the review, which convened in the East Council chamber with 3 council members, Steward Tomas, and the council's appointed record keeper. She brought 5 years of hound feed allocation logs, each entry in her small, precise handwriting, dated and timed, with no morning missing. She brought a letter she had requested from Cook, who had, without ceremony or question, produced it in 2 hours, confirming the origin of the bone scraps and the duration of the arrangement. She brought the medical register she had found in the keep's lower archive, 3 days of searching, and 2 evenings with archivist Godwin, who had, with the quiet delight of someone finally asked to produce the thing he had been keeping, pulled the document without a word and handed it to her across the reading table. The register confirmed that the North Wing pass-through had been installed 400 years ago as a medical access point for keeping the wolf fed during periods of the Alpha King's incapacitation, and its continued use for that purpose was not only permitted, but was in historical fact required. She brought one other thing, which she read aloud when the council had finished reviewing the first 3, the clause in Protocol 14 that explicitly exempted interactions pertaining to the welfare of the Alpha King's wolf from its private setting restrictions, on the grounds that the wolf's welfare was a crown matter, not a personal one, and as such superseded the protocol entirely. She read it without emphasis. She set it down. The council member who had opened the review, a man named Prael, who had the expression of someone who had expected a door to open easily and had found instead that it was a wall, looked at his colleagues. There was a silence. Tomas, who had sat through the presentation with the expression of a man suppressing something that was not entirely neutral, said, "The review finds no violation." He paused. "The log record is exemplary." Sarah said, "Thank you." She gathered her documents. She said, because it was accurate, and because she thought Prael deserved accuracy rather than charity. If the concern was genuine, I understand why it was raised. If it was procedural strategy, I hope the record is useful. She left before anyone had to answer that. In the corridor outside the chamber, she stood for a moment and let out a breath she had been containing with some effort. The stone was cold against her shoulder when she leaned against it. She thought of the north wing door and the warmth of it, and the way the resonance through the iron had become, across all these mornings, the thing she took the shape of her day from, the fixed point from which everything else was measured. She thought, I would very much like to go home. And then she noticed that home had, without her making a decision about it, come to mean the north corridor in the early morning light. That was interesting. She filed it. She went to find Archivist Godwin to return the register and to thank him properly. Kaelin found her in the archive that evening. She was returning the documents she had borrowed, stacking them with the same careful order she had found them in, and he came through the low archive door and stopped at the end of the reading table, and they regarded each other across the stacked records. He said, "Tomas told me." She said, "I assumed he would." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the documents, looking at the hound feed log, specifically, her 5 years of small handwriting. He pulled it toward him and looked at it for a moment, and she watched something move through his expression that she did not try to name. Then he set it back down. He said, "They thought it would be a simple matter." She said, "Most people find the record inconvenient." He looked at her, not with the measuring look this time. This was different. This had the quality of something resolved, a man who has been fighting a current and has finally put his feet down and stood. He said, "I want to say this plainly." She waited. "The bond," he said. "I know what it is. I have known what it is since the second morning." He paused, as though choosing the next words with the particular care they required. "My wolf knows what you are to it. I have been conducting an argument with that knowledge." She did not drop her eyes. She said steadily, "I know." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm not asking because of what the wolf wants." He stopped, corrected himself, which she found more honest than the initial phrasing. "I'm not only asking because of that. I'm asking because I watched you walk that corridor for weeks before I came to it myself, and I watched how you did it." He paused. "Not performance, not strategy, not ambition. You went because something needed you to go." She was quiet. He said, "I would like to keep going." The words landed very simply in the room, she thought, with the composed precision that was the closest she came to self-disclosure. You could say, "That is not a declaration." You could say, "He is only describing a direction of travel." And you would be right, and it would still be the most directly she had been addressed by anyone in Ashenvale Keep in 5 years. She said, "So would I." His expression did something then that she thought she would not see again quickly. It opened, fractionally, the way a room opens when a window is cracked. Not dramatic, just more breathable. He said, "Then we go." She thought there was more to say. She thought the shape of the conversation required more weight, more architecture, more formal acknowledgement of the distance between what they were and what this would mean. She thought all of this, and she also thought, he said it plainly, and he meant it, and plainness is what I trust. So she said yes, and they stood in the archive, among 5 years of her handwriting, until the last light left the window, and it was enough. Spring came. It did not do so quickly or with any particular announcement. The frost in the east arch came less often, and then it came only in the early dark, and then one morning it did not come at all, and the stones under the arch were dry and pale in the light. The cold pantry began to require less in the way of insulation, and Sarah reorganized its contents accordingly, updating the ledger with the particular pleasure of someone who finds competence genuinely satisfying rather than merely necessary. Kaelin came to the north corridor every morning. This was known, now, in the way things became known in Ashenvale Keep, not through announcement, but through the accumulation of daily evidence. The head groundskeeper's expression recalibrated. Aldrin's manner toward Sarah altered in a direction that was not warmth yet, but was no longer the practiced bureaucratic patience. The kitchen staff's general behavior around the hound feed allocation taking on a quality of studied discretion that amounted, in practice, to support. The wolf, over the weeks since the review, and through the slow turn toward spring, had come to the door, not to emerge, that remained, for now, its own private timing, but to the door, consistently, so that when Sarah placed her hand against the iron, she could feel it on the other side, the warmth and the breathing, and the resonance that she had come to hold, as a kind of conversation, conducted in a language that did not require words. Kaelin placed his hand against the door on the morning after the review. She had watched him do it, standing to the side, giving him the space the moment required. His eyes had closed. He had stood there for a long time, longer than she had ever stood there, and the sound from inside had changed again. Not the answer sound, something older than that, something lower, something that lived in the range of things a person does not translate. When he withdrew his hand and opened his eyes, she had not said anything. He had not said anything. They had stood in the corridor, while the early light came grey and level through the high slit window at the far end, and she had taken his hand, briefly, and let it go, and that had been enough to say what the moment required. By April, she was no longer in the lower corridor rotation in the same solitary way. There was still the pantry, because the pantry needed her, and she was genuinely the best person for it, and there was still the north corridor every morning, which had not become any less important for being witnessed. But other things had shifted in ways she noticed by their absence. She no longer returned to a single cold room. She no longer ate in the kitchen at the tail end of service. She no longer carried the sense of being a figure in the keep's peripheral vision, rather than its center. She was not yet its center. That was not where she aimed. She aimed at permanence, at the quiet, recurring morning that would mean she had, finally, arrived somewhere that intended to keep her. In May, the wolf came to the door and pressed its nose through the small pass-through, and Sarah let it take the dried meat from her hand. She felt the brush of it against her fingers, careful, deliberate, a pressure that held and then released, and she stood very still and let the moment be exactly what it was. Beside her, Kaelin's hand was against the door, and she felt his breathing change. The wolf's nose was warm, and the morning light from the high window came in at a low amber angle and landed on the stone floor in a stripe that reached almost to her boots. She said, quietly, "To the door, to the wolf, to the morning. There you are." The wolf was still for a moment. Then it withdrew. The pass-through was empty. The door was warm. She looked up at Kaelin. His expression was open, in the way she had seen it only twice before, and it undid something in her chest that she had been, without quite knowing it, holding carefully closed for a long time. He was looking at the door, and then he was looking at her, and what she saw was not a king conducting a calculation. It was a man who had been, for 217 years, the keeper of something fasting in the dark, and who was standing in the first morning of it being otherwise. There were no words for that. She did not try to produce them. She took his hand. She held it. The amber light moved on the floor. The morning after, and the morning after that, and every morning of that first summer, Sarah woke before the keep stirred and walked the corridor she had always walked, and the door was warm when she arrived, and she spoke in her quiet, factual morning way about whatever the day had brought her, and the wolf listened, and Kaelin stood at the wall with his arms folded and listened too, and sometimes he spoke, which was not something he had done easily 6 months ago, and which was still not effortless, but which was, increasingly, something he chose. The uniform that had never fit quite right had been replaced, not at her request, but because one morning a new one had appeared, folded outside the pantry door with no note, and she had put it on because it fit, and there was no reason to keep wearing something that no longer did the job the old one had done, which was, in its way, to keep her at the right size. She carried the pantry ledger still, because it was hers, and it was accurate, and the kitchen had not had a spoiled delivery since. Her wrists were still ink-stained by Thursday. Some things persisted because they were simply part of the work, and the work was simply part of her, and there was no occasion to be otherwise. It was not remarkable. It was simply the morning, and the wolf, and the man who had finally placed his feet on the ground and stood, and the amber light that arrived at the same angle every clear day and landed just short of her boots. It was hers, and it was everything. Would you have kept coming back to that door, morning after morning, not knowing if anything would answer? Let me know in the comments below.